I'm getting a lot of questions about the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kherson. Like, where is it? How is it playing out? Has it started yet? Things like that. And then we also have explosions in Crimea and in southern Ukraine and even in mainland Russia. And that's a kind of mystery because it's not entirely clear what weapons Ukraine might be using to do this. And because these explosions are so spectacular, then some people assume that they are, in fact, the counteroffensive that Ukraine has been talking about, because like it's the most notable thing that we can see. So there is some confusion. And in this video, I want to answer some of these questions about what I think is going on. Like, what is the Ukrainian plan for this counteroffensive? What is it that they're trying to do? How are all these things connected? And what is going to happen afterwards? Ukraine has announced a counteroffensive to liberate the city of Kherson, and we should understand that as meaning the areas of Kherson Oblast that are west of the Dnipro River. There has been a lot of discussion about why Ukraine would announce such a counteroffensive before it happens, because from a military point of view, it would make more sense to sort of surprise the enemy. But Ukrainian officials started to talk about this already way back in June. And in the first half of July, it was repeated again and again by government ministers and even by Zelensky himself. And I think by now, it's pretty clear that this announcement of a big counteroffensive that would happen in August was meant basically as a kind of trap. That it was not enough for Ukraine to liberate Kherson, but they also wanted to take out a lot of Russian soldiers in the process. Because this area west of Dnipro is probably the one area in the whole operational theater where Ukraine, well, basically has all the advantages and Russia has all the disadvantages. So it's, from a Ukrainian point of view, it's better to fight as many Russians as possible in this area than it is to fight them later on somewhere else. And getting Russia into this trap was actually pretty easy, because the choice that Putin was faced with, and yes, I do believe that this is the kind of problem that would be presented for Putin personally, basically was to either withdraw from Kherson and give it up without a fight, or to send in reinforcements. And of course, Putin was not going to give up Kherson without a fight, so Russia started pouring reinforcements into the area. So when we talk about a Ukrainian counteroffensive right now, I think we should understand it in terms of these two goals. Like, yes, they want to liberate Kherson, but before they get to that, they want to take out as many Russian soldiers as possible. So that is to kill them, or to take them as prisoners of war, or to force them to abandon their equipment and swim across the river, right? And I think this is the reason for much of the confusion, because it doesn't look like that picture we normally have of what an offensive looks like. Like, the Ukrainians are not actually moving forward very much. Like, instead, they're focusing on what in my last video, I called a Kesselschlacht. Over on Twitter, Phillips O'Brien used the term accelerated attritional warfare, and I think that's actually a very good term to explain what's going on. That this whole war is a war of attrition, and Ukraine's strategy has all along been to cause the Russians to have as many casualties as possible, rather than actually defending specific pieces of terrain. And then what we see around Kherson is that Ukraine has figured out a way to sort of accelerate that attrition among the Russians by basically luring them into a trap where they send reinforcements into an essentially undefendable area. So this is what the counteroffensive looks like. Yes, they want to liberate Kherson, but before they get to that, they have a bunch of attrition work to do first. And we are right now in that phase of the counteroffensive where the purpose is the attrition of the Russian forces. So that is why we can't see the counteroffensive on the map, because the front line isn't actually moving yet. Like, Ukraine can't actually push the Russians back right now and conquer the terrain, because Russia has reinforced the area. but the Ukrainians expect them to run out of supplies eventually, and then it will be easy. Like in my last video, I talked about the bridges and how Ukraine can target the Russian logistics by destroying the bridges. And I also talked about how this war seems to have entered into what can be called the third phase of the war. And I actually thought about how these two things can be combined into a kind of illustration about how I think we should understand what Ukraine is trying to do. Because I think there is actually a very clear connection between the phases of the war and the success of Russian logistics. So the first phase of the war was the first month or so, when Russia was attacking more or less all over the place. And in my last video, I talked about these phases in terms of who had the strategic initiative. So we can say that Russia had the initiative because they were the ones who could decide the time and the place of the battles. And then I'm also actually going to just very crudely name a winner of each phase. And this is, of course, super simplified because in reality, a lot of things happen for both sides. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to go with it. So Ukraine won the first phase, and Russia had to abandon their efforts to take Kiev. And the decisive factor in this phase of the war was to a large extent that the Russian logistics didn't work. They had very long supply lines that Ukraine could target, and they were unable to sustain the fight. Phase 2 was the period from April to July. In this period, the big theme was the Russian offensive in Donbass. It was again Russia who had the strategic initiative because they chose to focus on this area and Ukraine just sort of had to accept that. I'm going to say that Russia was the winner of this phase. I know many people might have different opinions about it, but I think if we look at what Russia was trying to achieve, then they did actually make significant progress on the ground in Donbass between April and July. And the decisive factor was that the Russian logistics worked so well. They were able to bring enormous amounts of ammunition to the front line every day. This was a fight that must go over in history as one of the most intense artillery bombardments ever performed by any military force. And the reason they could do that was that they had short and reliable supply lines from the ammunition depots to the front line. Okay, so when we look at this third phase, then we can say that it is the Battle of the South. And it is happening because Ukraine has become strong enough to seize the initiative. And they have received weapons like HIMARS that can target the Russian logistics behind the front lines. And I think we can understand this third phase as Ukraine's attempt to recreate the conditions from phase 1. So they are going very hard after the Russian logistic systems. And that's what the attacks in Crimea and other places are about. It's not the counteroffensive per se, but they are targeting Russia's logistics. And there's a lot of mystique about these attacks because we don't know for sure actually how Ukraine is doing it. Like officially, they don't have any weapons with that kind of range. So some people speculate that it's the work of special forces or something like that. And some of it probably is. But I also think it looks like Ukraine now has some missiles that have a range of up to like those 200, 300 kilometers. But the point of the attacks is exactly to make the Russian logistics as complicated as possible, to make the supply lines as long as they can possibly be, because Russia now has to pull the ammunition depots even further away from the front line, and they have to use trucks instead of railroads and stuff like that. And it's much less efficient. And the supply lines in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia oblasts are actually beginning to look very much like they did in the northern part of Ukraine in phase 1 of the war. So the attacks on Crimea are not directly a part of the counteroffensive that Ukraine has been talking about, because that counteroffensive is only the small area west of the Dnieper River, but it is a part of the bigger plan. Like, it shows that the Ukrainian vision is that the liberation of Kherson, it's just the beginning. Like, they have special plans, I'd say, for the fighting of Kherson. That's why they set up that trap to get more Russians to cross the river, because they started to attack the bridges. But in combination, that accelerated attrition that Phillips O'Brien talked about and the sustained attacks on the Russian supply lines will mean that Ukraine can be in a pretty good position after the Battle of Kherson. Like, they will have all the territory west of the Dnipro, and it will be very easy to defend afterwards because Russia is not going to come back across the river once they have lost that foothold. And then Ukraine will have freed up all those forces from the Kherson area that they can then redeploy for a new counteroffensive somewhere else. So that could, for example, be an attack from the north down toward the Melitopol area. And Russia would be in a really tough position for such a fight because they don't have more forces that they can move from the Donbas area because they already did that for the Battle of Kherson. And they don't have good logistics either because Ukraine will have been hitting that infrastructure for months. Of course, my point here is not that all this is guaranteed to happen, but I do think that this is what Ukraine is trying to do. And to be honest, I must say that I think it's hard to see what Russia can really do about it. Like, of course, we should not disregard the possibility that they can come up with some solution and turn the tide. But I must say that I think Russia is in a vulnerable position right now. But the important point about the counteroffensive is that the current battle in the Kherson area is just the first area where this is happening. And that could go on for several months, perhaps. But after that, Ukraine will redeploy and make a new counteroffensive somewhere else. So we can have, for example, a Christmas offensive or something like that. So we should understand this third phase of the war as a series of Ukrainian counteroffensives. And this one around Kherson is just the beginning. Okay, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. That will tell the YouTube algorithm to suggest it to more people. And you can also subscribe to the channel. And if you click that little bell icon, then you will also get a notification when I publish a new video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again next time.